There's a photograph taken backstage at Woodstock in 1969. A young man, barely 22 years old, barefoot on a patch of grass, guitar across his lap, eyes closed, fingers trembling against the strings like he's trying to hold something sacred in place before it disappears. He looks like a man who has just touched fire and does not yet know he is burned. What you cannot see in that photograph is what he had eaten the night before, or rather, what he had not eaten. You cannot see the hunger behind the music, the terror living just beneath the transcendence. And you certainly cannot see the thing that would follow him for the next 5 decades. The invisible wound that all that fame, all that noise, all those sold-out arenas could never quite fill. Who is the real man behind one of the most recognizable guitar sounds in the history of recorded music? What does it cost to carry genius inside a body that was broken before it ever had a chance to be whole? And why, at 78 years old, is he still playing? Not for the applause, but for something far older, far more desperate, and far more honest than any standing ovation could ever provide. Carlos Santana was born on July 20th, 1947, in Autlan de Navarro, a small municipality in the western Mexican state of Jalisco. If you have never been to Autlan, picture a place where the mountains fold down into valleys the color of dried tobacco, where the air smells of wood smoke and roasting corn in the evening, and where the church bells in the plaza carry sound so clearly you can hear them 2 villages away. It was the kind of town where everybody knew your business before you did, where poverty was not shameful because it was universal, and where music lived in the walls of every house whether the family could afford instruments or not. His father, Jose Santana, was a mariachi musician. This matters more than it might sound. Jose was not a hobbyist strumming a guitar on Sunday afternoons. He was a working musician, a man who made his living with his hands on strings, who played weddings and festivals and cantinas, who understood that music was not a hobby or a dream. It was labor. It was bread. It was the thing that kept the lights on, or more precisely, the candles burning, in a house where electric light was not always guaranteed. Carlos grew up watching his father tune a violin before dawn, watching his fingers move with the practiced ease of someone who has done a thing so many times it has become indistinguishable from breathing. He absorbed this. He could not help but absorb it. At age 5, Carlos was given a toy violin. He did not play with it the way other children played with toys. He studied it. He held it like it was alive. By 8, he had moved on to the real instrument, sitting in on sessions with his father, listening to the way a single sustained note could hold an entire room still, could make grown men put down their drinks and forget whatever argument they had been about to start. The violin was his first love, but it was a complicated love, because playing with his father also meant watching his father. And watching his father meant understanding, even as a very young child, the complicated geography of a man who could make beauty with his hands and still come home carrying something dark. The family relocated from Autlan first to Tijuana in 1955 when Carlos was 8 years old. Tijuana in the mid-1950s was a border city in every sense of that word, a place caught between 2 nations, 2 languages, 2 economies, a city that was neither fully Mexican nor anywhere close to American, but something stranger and more electric than either. It was raw and loud and smelled of diesel and tortillas and money changing hands in the dark. For a boy from the quieter valleys of Jalisco, Tijuana was overwhelming and also magnificent. Because Tijuana was where Carlos first heard the blues, he heard it drifting out of bars along Avenida Revolution where American tourists came to drink without consequence. He heard on a radio, crackling with static, a sound so human and so raw it stopped him on the sidewalk. B.B. King, T-Bone Walker, John Lee Hooker. Music that did not ask permission. Music that did not decorate pain. It became pain, and in becoming it, somehow transformed it into something survivable. Carlos pressed his ear against walls to catch more of it. He followed the sound through the city the way you follow the smell of something cooking when you have been hungry for too long. It was in Tijuana that he made the transition from violin to guitar. He was around 11 or 12. His father gave him a guitar. And the moment his fingers found the strings, something closed and something else opened. The guitar felt like his own voice in a way the violin, as much as he loved it, had never quite managed. He began busking on the streets of Tijuana, playing for tourists outside the clubs his father performed inside of. Think about that image for a moment. A Mexican boy, barely into his adolescence, standing on a hot sidewalk in the afternoon sun with a guitar too big for his frame, playing for pocket change while the world walked past without stopping. The guitar was already the symbol that would follow him everywhere. Not an instrument, but an extension of something he could not otherwise express. In 1961, the family moved again, this time crossing the border permanently to San Francisco. Carlos was 13. His father went ahead, and his mother, Josefina, brought the children north later. The crossing itself was unremarkable by the standards of border crossings. No dramatic scene, no cinematic moment of arrival. Just a family moving through checkpoints with everything they owned compressed into what they could carry. San Francisco was cold in a way Tijuana was not. The fog came in off the bay every evening like a gray curtain closing over the hills, and Carlos, used to desert heat, felt it in his bones like a reminder that he had arrived somewhere unfamiliar. What followed was not the fairy tale of immigrant success. It was harder and stranger than that. Carlos enrolled in school and found himself caught between languages, between cultures, neither entirely Mexican nor recognizable as American. He was quiet. He was watchful. He was the kid who sat in the back and drew patterns on his notebook that looked like music notations and did not speak unless necessary. But in his room, at night, the guitar spoke for him. He practiced with a discipline that bordered on compulsion, not because anyone told him to, but because the guitar was the one place where he did not feel foreign. But there's a wound that sits beneath all of this, a wound that Carlos Santana did not speak about publicly for decades, a wound that most people who bought his records in the 1970s and danced his music had no idea existed. He disclosed it only later in life, in his autobiography, Divided Soul, and in subsequent interviews, and the disclosure was not made casually. He was 11 or 12 years old in Tijuana, still a child, still playing on those hot sidewalks when he was sexually abused. The perpetrator was a man who preyed on children. The abuse was not a single incident. It went on for a period of time, and Carlos told no one. Not his mother, not his father, not a single person. He carried alone, the way you carry something so heavy and so shameful that the carrying itself becomes part of your identity before you even understand what identity means. This is the wound. This is the thing beneath all the music. To understand what that kind of silence costs a child, you have to understand the particular mathematics of childhood trauma. The mind of a child who has been violated in this way does not process the violation the way an adult might. Instead, it files the experience somewhere deep and unlabeled, somewhere below conscious thought, and it builds walls around the filing. The child continues to function. The child continues to eat breakfast and go to school and, in Carlos's case, practice guitar until his fingers ached. But the wound does not disappear. It waits. It shapes the way you move through the world without you ever understanding why you move the way you do. It makes you reach for things that can fill the silence. Music, performance, love, God, substances, anything that can cover the sound of what happened in a room when you were 11 years old and too small and too alone to stop it. Carlos reached for the guitar. And then, eventually, he reached for other things. San Francisco in the mid-1960s was the wrong city in which to be a troubled young man with a guitar and an unexamined wound. Or perhaps it was exactly the right city, depending on how you define right. The counterculture was blooming in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood like something extravagant and slightly dangerous. The Grateful Dead were rehearsing in houses where the walls vibrated. Janis Joplin was singing from some place so deep inside her own pain that audiences felt it in their chests before they understood it with their ears. LSD was being distributed at concerts as freely as programs. And Carlos Santana, a young Mexican-American musician who had been playing blues-inflected guitar in Mission District clubs since he was 15, was watching all of this with wide eyes and a growing hunger. He formed the Santana Blues Band in 1966. The name was later shortened. The sound was already unlike anything else happening in San Francisco. A fusion of blues and rock and Latin percussion, conga drums and timbals driving rhythms underneath the guitar lines in a way that felt like two musical traditions suddenly recognizing each other across a crowded room. Bill Graham, the legendary concert promoter who ran the Fillmore Auditorium, heard them and started booking them. The band was building momentum, but Carlos himself was also starting to experiment with psychedelics. Heavily, LSD became a regular part of his life in a way that, in retrospect, he has described as not entirely recreational. There's something important to understand about how substances function for someone carrying a wound like his. They do not create the escape. They reveal the longing for escape that was already there. Carlos was not a happy young man who stumbled into drug use out of curiosity. He was a damaged young man who found that certain chemicals temporarily dissolved the distance between himself and the thing he was looking for: peace, connection, the sensation of being held by something larger than the ordinary world. This, he would later understand, was also what the guitar did for him, what God would eventually do for him. He was always searching for the same thing, just through different doors. The lowest point came not in a dramatic single moment, but in a slow erosion. By the early 1970s, Santana, the band, had achieved something almost impossible. Their performance at Woodstock in August 1969 had been watched by 500,000 people and had made Carlos Santana, almost overnight, one of the most talked about guitarists in America. Their debut album went gold. Their second album, Abraxas, released in September 1970, became one of the defining records of its era. Oi Como Virginia Black Magic Woman. The guitar tone, that long, sustaining, almost human note that seemed to breathe rather than simply ring, was instantly recognizable. There was nothing else that sounded like it. And yet, Carlos was taking so many substances during this period, LSD, mescaline, cocaine, that his internal landscape had become nearly unnavigable. He has described periods during this time when he could not tell where the music stopped and the chemical experience began. Relationships within the band were fracturing. His personal life was chaotic. And beneath the chaos, the wound from Tijuana was still there, untreated, unacknowledged, still waiting in that deep, unlabeled file where he had put it when he was 12 years old. The fame was not filling it. The money was not filling it. The guitar was still the closest thing to filling it. But even the guitar, played on the largest stages in the world, could not quite reach what needed to be reached. There's a particular loneliness to being famous and still empty. Most people who have never experienced it imagine that fame must be a kind of solution, that once you are known and loved by enough people, the original ache must surely be answered. But fame is not intimacy. It is the performance of intimacy at scale. And a man who learned to perform before he had ever been truly seen carries that performance everywhere, even into the moments that are supposed to be private. Why 1972? Carlos was at a crossroads that he could not quite articulate to anyone around him. He could feel the music was still there, still the truest thing about him, still the guitar in his hands like that photograph from the grass at Woodstock. But everything around the music was threatening to collapse the structure that held it. He was on the verge of losing himself so completely that the guitar might not have been able to find him again. But then, something changed. Someone arrived. In 1972, Carlos encountered Sri Chinmoy, a spiritual teacher based in New York. For a man who had been looking for something to fill the space that substances and fame could not, the discovery of a structured spiritual practice was, as he later described it, like suddenly finding the word for something he had been trying to say his whole life. He became a devoted follower. He stopped using psychedelics. He began meditating daily. He changed his name, briefly, to Devadip, meaning, in Sanskrit, the lamp of the light of God. He renounced everything he associated with the previous, chaotic chapter of his life with an absoluteness that some found admirable and others found alarming. The guitar, through all of this, was still there. Still the same symbol. still the same object of return. The mid-1970s were artistically complex for Santana. Some of his most devoted fans did not know what to make of the music he was making under Chimoya's influence. Albums like Love, Devotion, Surrender, recorded with John McLaughlin, and Illuminations, recorded with Alice Coltrane, were spiritual works, jazz-inflected, meditative, searching. They were not Oi Como, Virginia. They were not the Fillmore. Some radio stations did not know where to put them. Some critics dismissed them as self-indulgent. But Carlos was not making music for the critics. He was making music for the same reason he always had, to reach the thing inside him that could not be reached by any other means. His relationship with Chinmoy eventually ended in 1982, after a decade. The nature of the departure has been discussed obliquely in various interviews. What is clear is that Carlos walked away having gained something important: a framework for understanding his own spirituality, a discipline of daily meditation and prayer that he never entirely abandoned even after he left the formal structure of the teacher-student relationship. And also having learned something important about the difference between surrender to a teacher and surrender to God directly. In 1973, he had married Deborah King, the daughter of blues musician Saunders King. Deborah was steady in the way that Carlos was volatile. She was grounded in the way he was always reaching for transcendence. Their relationship lasted through all of the spiritual explorations of the 1970s, through the quieter, more uncertain 1980s, through the enormous commercial comeback of the late 1990s. They raised 3 children together: Salvador, Stella, and Angelica. The family was the quiet anchor that the public rarely saw, the thing that the biographical summaries tend to mention briefly before moving on to the next album. But the family was not brief. It was the longest continuous note in his life. The 1980s were hard years commercially. Rock music was moving in directions that had little interest in Carlos Santana's particular synthesis. MTV launched in 1981, and what it rewarded was visual spectacle of a very specific, very white, very synthesizer-driven variety. Latin rock was not a category that fit comfortably on the channel's rotation. The albums Santana released through the decade, Shango, Beyond Appearances, Freedom, were received with varying degrees of indifference by the mainstream. He was not forgotten. He continued to tour. But the cultural moment had moved elsewhere, and he was no longer at its center. He has spoken in interviews about this period with a directness that is unusual for artists discussing commercial decline. He says he was not bitter. He says he understood that he had to keep making the music regardless of whether the music was being met where he was making it. He kept the guitar. He kept meditating. He kept the practice that Chinmoy had given him even after Chinmoy himself was gone from his life. And he waited with what he has described as a kind of divine patience for the tide to come back. In 1998, he signed with Arista Records. Label head Clive Davis, who had a particular gift for recognizing when an artist's time had come back around, saw something in Carlos that the commercial landscape of the 1980s had temporarily obscured. They began working on an album together, and what they were building was not a nostalgia project. It was a genuine attempt to place Carlos Santana's guitar, that sound, that sustain, that almost human breath held in a single note, in conversation with the contemporary music of the late 1990s. Supernatural was released on June 15, 1999. It sold 30 million copies. It won 9 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year. Smooth, the Rob Thomas collaboration that led the album, spent 12 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Carlos Santana, at 51 years old, was somehow impossibly more famous than he had ever been. The guitar was back. The same guitar. The same man. He stood on the stage at the Grammy Awards in February 2000 with a Milagro, a small Mexican votive charm. Around his neck, his eyes closed the way they were in that photograph from Woodstock, his body held with the particular stillness that comes not from composure, but from something running very deep underneath composure. He had worn the Milagro for years. It was a symbol from his childhood, from Jalisco, from the Catholic tradition of his mother's household, where small metal charms were pressed into the hands of saints and left at altars as prayers made physical. He wore it as a reminder of where he came from and what he owed to the thing that had always carried him through. After the supernatural triumph, Carlos did not disappear again. He continued to record and tour through the 2000s through the 2010s. He married again in 2010. Deborah had filed for divorce in 2007 after 34 years of marriage, a separation that Carlos described as devastating, a necessary loss that took years to make any kind of peace with. His second wife, Cindy Blackman, is a drummer, a musician who shares his spiritual orientation and his commitment to the practice of music as something beyond entertainment. He has described their relationship as a recognition. Like meeting someone your soul already knew. In 2019, Carlos Santana disclosed publicly, in his memoir The Universal Tone, the childhood abuse he had suffered in Tijuana. He was 71 years old when the book was published. Think about what it means to carry something for 60 years before you're ready to say it out loud. Think about what it means to have built an entire career, an entire public identity, an entire philosophy of music as prayer, and to know the whole time that there was a thing you had not said. The disclosure did not diminish him. It explained him. It made the music retroactively even more extraordinary because now you understood what it had been doing all along. The guitar was not just an instrument. It had always been the place where the unsayable went to become sound. At T78, Carlos Santana is still playing. He announced a residency in Las Vegas at the House of Blues in Mandalay Bay, which has continued for years. He still walks on stage with that guitar, still closes his eyes, still finds the note that sustains longer than seems physically possible, still seems to be reaching for something beyond the stage and the lights and the crowd. He had a health scare in 2021 when he collapsed on stage in Michigan due to heat exhaustion and dehydration, a terrifying moment that reminded everyone, including Carlos, that the body has limits the spirit does not always acknowledge. He recovered. He came back. He played again. He speaks now about music the way a theologian might speak about prayer, not as performance, but as act. He says that when he plays, he is not performing for the audience. He is creating a space in which the divine can enter. He says that the guitar is his method of worship. He says that every note is a conversation with something larger than himself, something he has called God and the universe and the light, language that is fluid and unconcerned with the boundaries between traditions. He moves freely between Christianity and Buddhism and indigenous Mexican spirituality and things that have no names in any tradition he has studied, and he seems entirely comfortable with the mobility, as if certainty were the lesser goal and openness were the point that he talks about his childhood, about Oatland and Tijuana and those streets where he played for tourist change, with a tenderness that is not nostalgia. It is not the sweetened version of the past. He does not pretend it was not hard. He does not soften what happened in the rooms where he was small and someone larger took something from him. He says that the healing was not linear. He says that the guitar was the first healer and meditation was the second, and love, imperfect, human, complicated love, was the third. And he says that at 78, he is still healing. Not because he has not done the work, but because healing is not a destination. It is the playing itself. It is the ongoing act of returning to the guitar. Now I want to speak to you directly. Not to the version of you that clicked on this video for entertainment, though that version is welcome here. I want to speak to the version of you that recognized something in his story before you could explain why. The version of you that has also carried something unspoken. The version of you that has also reached for things, music or substances or love or faith or the relentless forward motion of work, because the alternative was sitting still with a silence you did not know how to fill. Carlos Santana spent 60 years before he said the thing out loud. 60 years. And the music he made in those 60 years was not diminished by the silence. It was shaped by it. Every note he played on that guitar contained the weight of what he was not yet saying. And when he finally said it, the music did not change. The music had always known. The guitar had always known. The guitar was always the place where the truth went before he could speak it. You do not have to be Carlos Santana. You do not have to have sold 30 million albums, or played Woodstock, or collapsed on a stage in Michigan, or wore a Milagro around your neck on the night you won 9 Grammy Awards. But you might have something you are carrying the way he carried his. You might have something filed away in a place below language, something your hands know even when your voice does not. And if you do, if you're walking through your days with something unspoken, something heavy, something that has shaped the music of your life without you ever having named it, maybe what his story is asking is this: what would change if you said it? Not to the world, not in a memoir or an interview, just to yourself first, just in whatever quiet room you have access to. What would open? The guitar is still there. The same guitar from all those years ago, held by hands that are now 78 years old, hands that have been breaking and healing and playing and breaking again for over 6 decades. He closes his eyes and finds the note. He holds it. He lets it breathe. And in the holding, something that was hurt continues its long, necessary, never quite finished process of becoming whole. What is the thing you are still holding? And what would it sound like if you finally let it go?